Many consider the military buildup under Reagan to be the decisive factor in the end of the Cold War, forcing the Soviets into an escalation of the arms race they couldn't afford.
It is often said that Reagan intentionally drove the Soviets to spend themselves into their own grave, but the problem with that is that it completely ignores internal developments in the Soviet Union and the bloc. To say Reagan, or the United States for that matter, won the Cold War is to pretend that the Soviet Union didn't have its own historical dynamic, and of course it did.
In the early 1980s, the Soviet Union was ruled by aging hardliners. Their economic policies drained the economy, while their repressive political policies stifled dissent. The rise of Mikhail Gorbachev to power in 1985 brought new direction to the Soviet Union. Gorbachev recognized that in order to revitalize the Soviet Union, he had to initiate significant reform, both at home and abroad.
Gorbachev was trying to preserve communism. He felt that their economy had failed, and therefore he was going to have what he called perestroika, or restructuring. And then it turned out the bureaucrats resisted that, and so he launched the idea of glasnost, or open discussion, as a way of lighting fire under the bureaucrats. But once you open discussion and you ask people, do you want to be part of this system, they voted with their feet. The answer was no. They wanted out. And that essentially meant it was more and more difficult to control the system.
Gorbachev's initiatives also drew attention from abroad.
One day, Margaret Thatcher said to Reagan, Ronnie, she said, that's what she called him, Gorbachev is now running the Soviet Union, and he's a different kind of leader. He looks you straight in the eye. I think you can do business with this man. And really, said Ronnie, and he said, I'm going to try to take you up on this. So he decided to meet with Gorbachev, first in Geneva, then in Reykjavik, Iceland, and they actually made a deal, the first real disarmament treaty in the history of the United States and the Soviet Union. It was Ronald Reagan, of all people, who decided no longer to be a crusader, to become a pragmatist. He never called Russia, the Soviet Union, an evil empire again after he met Gorbachev.
Strong and fundamental moral differences continue to exist between our nations, but today, on this vital issue, at least, we have seen what can be accomplished when we pull together.
By the late 1980s, the economic and human toll of waging war in Afghanistan had depleted Soviet resources and demoralized the Soviet population. Gorbachev recognized that Russia would not win the war.
Gorbachev was critical, but he was a very honorable guy. And he realized that the Soviet Union was going broke. So what he did was an act of desperation.
In a move that surprised the West, he withdrew all Soviet troops from Afghanistan.
The effect of a disastrous 10-year war in Afghanistan on the Soviet Union was far worse than a similar war the United States conducted in Vietnam. And the United States emerges from Vietnam not unscathed, but Soviet Union, in effect, I think, really doesn't emerge from the war in Afghanistan. Afghanistan was the Soviet Union's Vietnam.
Shortages of food and other consumer items fed the smoldering fires of dissent in the Soviet Union and its satellite countries.
Let's face it, they have been living under this oppression now for 75 years. They had enough, 3 generations of it, and especially since they got permission, so to speak, from the Soviet leader himself, who didn't say anything when Lech Walesa said, I want elections in the Polish parliament. He looked the other direction, and they knew in Poland and in Hungary and in Bulgaria and in Romania that it was okay to get the hell out of the communist sphere, and they did. One after the other, the dominoes fell. They threw off the yoke of communism to become democratic governments. And Gorbachev had set this in motion without really intending it, but when he saw it happen, he left it alone because he realized the jig was up, and the last touch was the Berlin Wall.
General Secretary Gorbachev, if you seek peace, if you seek prosperity for the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, if you seek liberalization, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
Communist regimes of Eastern Europe began to fall in the late 1980s. The German citizens themselves took to the streets to dismantle the most powerful symbol of Soviet repression.
It was sort of like when Nelson Mandela was freed. I remember thinking that I would never actually see this happen.
There are thousands of people here in front of the wall at the Brandenburg Gate at this hour. Hundreds.
It was something, a lot of the newscasters, I remember how touched they were, especially the older ones that had been through the 10, 15, and 20 years of that or longer. It was really something to see that come across in their voice.
When the Berlin Wall came down, I thought, we finally won the war. I used to hang out at this little bar, and a lot of the Vietnam veterans would come in there, and I would tell them, you know what, you won the war. It just took a little bit longer. I said, but because of you, we won the war. And I don't know how many veterans actually started crying when I told them that. And I thanked them. I would say, thank you for what you did, for going out there and fighting for our country.
Soon after the collapse of the wall, the Soviet Union itself collapsed from within.